we felt like God was opening doors, even though we had no airplane, we had no hangar, we had no fuel, we had nothing, we had no training really for that matter. And the doors were open. So we just kept walking through them, even though the process was, like, long. I don't really think God cares too much where you go. It's that you go.
Welcome to Uncharted, a JAARS podcast where we fill in the map of what God is doing around the world. I'm your host, Craig Russell, and today I'm excited about our guest, Mike Bunn. Mike and his family served alongside our family for many years in Brazil. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks.
Welcome to our JAARS podcast called Uncharted. So
thanks for having me.
We're going to jump right in. We're not going to spend a lot of time. They'll get to know you throughout the podcast, but we just really want to focus on events in your life and in your family's life that God led you into some uncharted events and what that looked like, felt like. Maybe start us off with the desire to create a float program in Brazil where there was none.
Jody and I had just been asked by YWAM leadership of Brazil to come from Mozambique and check out Brazil and see where we could put an airplane. They didn't say float plane. They said an airplane in the Amazon region. So we traveled Manaus, Porto Velho, Belém, even southern Brazil, just visiting with leadership. And when we got to Porto Velho, we realized that with the SIL base there and the history of SIL having reached lots of unreached tribes in their early years with the float plane, we realized that that's where YWAM was. YWAM was in their early years relative to SIL, still trying to find unreached and places that didn't have a runway, like your more established locations.
And it had been more than 20 years since JAARS, SIL had their float plane.
Right. They said, yeah, no, we had float planes and we used them a lot. And YWAM said, well, we have a lot of locations that could benefit from a float plane. And so that's what led to a float plane. And at the time, I was not a float plane pilot.
Right.
I went home on furlough and got my float rating and was just this brand new float pilot. YWAM being YWAM, not like SIL or JAARS, which says, here's your airplane, here's your program. And so we went home and raised money. And
you had created from ground zero.
So you were there for pretty much most of that time, and that was a long process. Even after we bought the airplane and rebuilt it and started building the infrastructure in Porto Velho to have a float plane, the aircraft was in rebuild process, and then it was stuck in customs for 2 years. You remember that? But God had his plan going there that whole time. Had I had an airplane right now, today, when I wanted it, I wouldn't have had a hangar. I wouldn't have had a fuel depot. I wouldn't have had a relationship. I wouldn't have had experience that you guys gave me flying your airplane in Brazil. And so God in his wisdom did things differently.
Wherever there's water, you can land a float plane.
Or
even now, flying helicopter.
Right. I mean, that's the huge, I don't know, you flew my float plane too. And as the only other guy who did, you realized that how less stressed you were flying a float plane than you were a land plane. Because weather got bad and, things just weren't perfect. You just landed your airplane on.
Put it down on the lake and fish off the float.
On that.
Wait till the rain passes and go again.
Right. And so that was really nice. But the airplane filled a niche that the wheel plane didn't.
Couldn't.
And some of our missionaries were spending, days, if not a week or more, traveling by land from the runway location that you used to drop. I used to drop them on. You used to drop them on.
The land planes in that time period were 206s. What kind of float plane did you bring?
Well, I bought 1188, which was a Helio H295 that came from Peru. So it was OB, Oscar Bravo 1188, and everybody, all the old timers know my air. You bought 1188, and it was in mothballs, and we rebuilt it, put it back in the Amazon again, and then Peru, which was shutting down at the time, donated all of their spare stock to us. So another miracle, how would have I maintained a Helio in the Amazon without spare parts?
And it was the only one.
It was the only one at the time.
Yeah.
So I think it still is.
So let's talk a little bit about that rebuild process, because this is part of the Uncharted where you literally took the aircraft and flew around the U.S. on wheels, building the program and awareness, right?
Yeah.
You know, I was new at this, and I was a one-man show, not like JAARS. And so the idea, I think, was really the Lord's. I needed a way for people to be excited about funding a project that was pretty big. You know, buying an airplane for, I'd scheduled $150,000 to buy it and rebuild it, which was probably a little too little. But what I did is a lot like that drawing behind you. I made a drawing of the Helio blown apart in pieces, so it looked like a engineering drawing, and all around the border were the parts, both major and minor, that made up the airframe. And it was sort of blocked off in $5 parts, $10 parts, all the way up to, $10,000 parts and an engine. And people were able to buy the part that they wanted to. And so kids were buying spark plugs, and parents were buying windshield, and somebody was buying a carburetor. And so we funded the airplane that way. And when we bought it, it was not flyable. It was put in a container and it was shipped.
That's right. It was on mothballs.
It was mothballed. So we shipped it to Nebraska, where there was a ministry called Missionaire, and they rebuilt it. That process took nearly a year.
Both you and I have flown wheels and floats, and in fact, you're now flying helicopter for JAARS. But in float flying, talk a little bit about the runway being a dynamic runway, because it's a fluid environment. And I'm kind of connecting that to the name of our podcast, Uncharted, where a physical runway, a grass or asphalt, is documented. I don't want to overstate it, but almost every landing is different. Uncharted.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, I mean, you can think that no two landings are the same, and yet there were times where they were very similar.
Like you'd come into a lake, and typically the lake landings were similar.
Right.
They didn't change that much.
Maybe a little wind dynamic, but you have that on a paved
on a runway.
Yeah.
But on the rivers, especially between seasons, or high season, low season, there were times where you would come into a river, let's say it was high season, lots of water, lots of space, but possibly also a little bit of garbage floating down it. That wasn't the worst season for garbage, but you would land and find that there was no bank. There was no place to dock the airplane because the water came up to the bank level and then went into the trees. And so you'd have to come up gently towards the trees, shut the engine down, and start grabbing branches and pull yourself towards the shade of the under overgrowth. And there were times, even the Denny tribe, you've been there. There were high water seasons where I'd land at the Denny and I couldn't dock. It looked like maybe you could try, but the river was too narrow. The flow was too great. The Denny would come out in the canoe and paddle and hold onto your canoe in the middle of the river and keep you in place while you offloaded either missionaries or supplies. Yeah, they'd hold onto your floats. And then you'd come back there, 6 months later, and there would be muddy banks or dirt banks all the way down to snags of wood, and your landing site was smaller. It was more difficult because you might have had to, navigate around stuff, but you could dock and you could stop, you could get out, you could go to the bathroom if you had to, you could visit with the missionaries, but not in high season. So from one season to another, and all the in-betweens in the flushing season when the water is receding out of the jungle, then all those trees and junk sometimes you'd have to land on the right side of the river or the left side of the river.
Depends where the flow was. When God calls us into events in our life that we haven't been there yet, how do you prepare for that? What were you looking at? What were the signs when you were on approach or flying overhead when you would look at that fluid dynamic and you're like, where am I going to land? Because you could pretty much pick anywhere on the river, right?
I hate to say this, but it depended on your state of mind and how hurried you were. Is there a big storm coming? Here comes the river. I know I'm going to dock up there. Sometimes
if you've been there before or not.
If you've been there before, then I just pull into final approach and start evaluating things as I come down. Was I concerned about wind? Yeah, but we didn't have that much wind in the Amazon unless there was a storm nearby.
Well, that's what we said, right?
Yeah.
If there was wind, you knew there was
something going on. So it would depend. Like if I was dropping your in-laws off, I could go take the really long straightaway landing site downriver and taxi for 20 minutes or 15, whatever it took to get back upriver and drop them at their house. Or since it was a helio, I knew that I can land a helio anywhere. And the planning for landing the helio wasn't a big deal because it wasn't like, do I have enough space? Yes, you have enough space. The bad part is, can I get out of here? The helio is its touchdown speed when you're not necessarily the approach speed, because we didn't really fly at STOL on approach.
STOL meaning
short takeoff and landing.
So it's a special configuration that a STOL aircraft has, a short takeoff and landing aircraft, and the helio, it has the leading edge slats.
Right. High lift, high drag.
Yeah.
Lots of power demand, and you can fly a helio STOL on floats, but it's not needed. A lot of guys think, oh, I can fly at STOL. You don't. You really shouldn't, because if you get a downdraft, then you're really sort of in all sorts of world of hurt. But the nice part is that when you round out and you touch down on the water, you're still touching down at the exact same speed as a STOL landing.
Right.
So you hit the water at maybe sub 40 miles an hour, and it stopped within what?
Literally stopped.
Like what? Do you think 200 feet at the most?
Easy.
You're done.
Yeah.
And if that was any of the other missions aircraft, like the 206s or the Caravans, you have a shallower approach, a higher touchdown speed. Rough water gets a little difficult, but the helio just handled that well. But then it has its downsides too. So you remember those old missionaries in Jamamaji? What are their names again? Camel said, "Oh, you should come and land and drop us off at the nearest lake." I don't know if you remember that. And they said, "Oh, Fulani Jitao, whatever his name was, he used to land here all the time in the Norsemen." And I said, well, if they did it, I can surely do it. And so I took him into that little lake. And when I realized how it landed beautifully, and then I looked at the lake and I go, I don't think I can get out of here. So I took all my seats out, took all my extra equipment. I made them carry it to the river, and I had to leave with nothing in the aircraft. So the helio can get in, but not necessarily get out, even though it takes off short.
So sometimes with Uncharted, we can land, but it's hard getting out and correcting that. That's there's a lot there, Mike, and God has given you and your family an incredible career of doing hard things and going to new places. You mentioned Mozambique, you mentioned Brazil. Talk a little bit of what it feels like taking your family somewhere that you haven't been before. Some of your thought process, like setting up for an approach on a river that you haven't landed on. There's certain ways you have to look at the eddies and look at where the main current is. What does that look like for packing your family up and going to a unknown area for you?
All those things you
There's
evaluate.
indicators.
There's indicators.
What are those indicators for you in making those decisions for your family? Like Abraham.
Sure.
God said, I'm going to take you to a land I'll show you.
Right.
And off he went.
Well, I'll start it out with one sort of seemingly unspiritual and spiritual at the same time statement that I don't really think God cares too much where you go. It's that you go, and that doesn't sound really super biblical, because definitely Abraham was called to do a certain thing. Moses was called to do a certain thing, but that they were willing to go, they were willing to go.
Your greatest ability is your availability. That's kind of what
true. It's true. So, but then along with that, at the same time, I'm not just Mike Bunn. I'm married to Jody Bunn. And then later on, all these kids started coming along. But the decision to go somewhere, I think, is made as a married couple, that we both pray about it. We both have peace from the Lord. And a lot of people want to have that really clear sign. Ooh, God said go, and so came over and confirmed that, and all these things, miraculous things.
Handwriting on the wall.
Sometimes happens, even in the Bible, you see that. But I think peace is the answer that is one of the biblical answers, and God will give you peace. And the peace is an answer. If you don't have peace, that unsettledness, that's probably the Holy Spirit talking to you about it. But knowing that my wife was fully called, wanting to go, was excited about it, we prayed about it together, and we saw that there was a need. We saw that it was reaching unreached people groups, which was where I think God's heart is, and where ours was too. That was what sort of set it for us. We had a 1-year-old at the time. Jody was pregnant, but they're not in the decision-making process.
That's when it's easy.
Right. That's when it's easy.
When they get older, then you start making decisions. Yeah. We felt like God was opening doors, even though we had no airplane, we had no hangar, we had no fuel, we had nothing. We had no training, really, for that matter. And the doors were open. So we just kept walking through them, even though the process was, like long, wasn't short.
The length of time it takes sometimes to reach some of those uncharted areas. It's hard to believe that in 2025 there are still languages without God's word.
Yeah.
And a lot of our listeners, it's hard to get their head around that.
Yeah.
And your journey into opening up the floatplane program was close to 10 years.
Yeah, it was 7 before the airplane arrived.
7 years.
Yeah, and I mean, that was eternity, because you're sitting here getting support. We were busy, right? We were building things. We were keeping our hands busy, but we weren't I wasn't flying a float plane.
Doing what you thought.
Right.
Well, where I want to take that is, how long did you fly on navigational charts in Brazil where it still had relief data undeclared, or I forget the exact words.
Right.
And then we'd
pencil incomplete.
Yeah. And we'd make pencil marks, and that was years.
Yeah.
Up into 2010.
I still have those charts sitting on my desk in the office.
Really?
Yeah. All penciled in and everything. Yeah. And the funny thing is, I don't know if you remember, but like your father-in-law and mother-in-law said, yeah, we live on this river. It should be right here. And when we flew there, it was like 5 miles off or 10 miles off. It was
the bends in the river weren't even
there.
I remember landing with a aeronautical student from Laterno who was down for a vision trip, and I shut off the 206 and the gyros were spooling down, and we had a Garmin 100, and he goes, "What's that noise?" And I said, "That's a gyro spooling down." He's like, "I've never heard that before," because in training they were flying with glass panels from early on, and having the Garmin 100 in there, they thought that was a relic of the past. And here we were going out over the uncharted jungle with and guys before us did that without
nothing,
just a chart and a watch. Pilotage and dead reckoning.
Makes me feel a little sick to my stomach just thinking about it. So, yeah.
What are some of the reasons that there are still groups of people without God's word? They don't have the roadmap that we have.
Finding tribes happened even after we left. You remember they found some tribes in the
Cruzeiro area.
Yeah, the Cruzeiro area that had never been contacted. So my perspective on unreached people groups is sort of multi-layered, but I think all of it's spiritually driven. So if we are in a spiritual battle on this earth, and one of those battles is that people are being blinded to get to know the Lord in any way, you could see that spiritual forces would have a purpose in isolating people. And the isolation could be that they're out in the middle of the mountains or the jungle in places you can't find them. It could also be that the government isolates them and doesn't let the gospel. By the isolation, the gospel doesn't get in because you can't go in there. These people have to remain pristine and their culture untouched. But the end result of doing that, of their isolation, whether that's self-isolation or government isolation, is that God's word doesn't get there. And whether they know that, whether they don't, that might not be their internal motivation as a government official, that's the result of it. So I think that they're being driven by spiritual forces, just like we are being driven by the Lord to go do these things, to go reach these people. with the good news.
Them the opportunity
Yeah.
to choose.
Right. And it all falls right into Jesus's commandment, right? Go into all the world and preach the gospel. When he talks to his disciples about the end times, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached as a testimony to all nations, all ethnos, and then the end will come. And the end will not come unless the job is done. And people go, how do you know that? Well, go to Revelation and you'll see that people from every nation, language, tribe, and tongue are represented in heaven. And the only way they can be there is if somebody tells them about it. Romans 10:14. That makes it clear that we have a job to do. And if we are kept from doing our job, either out of disobedience or out of governments not letting us, or anthropologists isolating people,
Not being available.
yeah, you've totally hindered the return of the Lord. I mean, that's at least my view of it. So
Right.
isolation is both purposeful spiritually. It could also be
Geographical. And
geographical too. Yeah.
you flew in Mozambique. You got some training at some training schools. But just talk a little bit about your journey and some of the preparation before you went into the uncharted area of
Yeah.
the type of flying you did in a remote area.
So, I mean, sadly to say, my preparation for going to Mozambique was not complete. So I went to Laterno. I got my flight ratings there, but that's basically about it. You know, I got
got
my
your
commercial-
certification.
I got my certifications. And yes, I did have, 1,000+ hours, and most of that was tail wheel by the time I went overseas. But I didn't have, that specific JAARS training you're talking about, having standards, having performance, boarding, everything from mountain flying to all these kinds of things that we do in training right now to get our guys ready to be in the jungle. Even,
Evaluating grass runways.
yeah,
and
tropical weather, you name it, just none of that. So I went and I survived the years that I was there, but that was really by God's
that's
grace.
setting the bar high.
Yeah, it's really setting the bar high. And so that is one part of my training, in quotes, but it wasn't what I would call a good part. It was God's grace.
So what does different training look like? What would have been different, or what should have been different, or what are you're actually in the training department at JAARS
Yeah,
now.
right.
What are you doing different
Right.
than what you received?
Well, the whole idea that aircraft performance is predictable. You can tell how long it's going to take you to get off and get on the ground. You have standards to how you load your cargo, how you secure.
Most aviation schools are training pilots to go fly on a 10,000-foot paved
Right.
runway with all kinds of parameters
Correct.
and
Yeah.
approaches, not a grass runway that's 600 meters long.
Right. And so, we were also taught with all of the available technology and all the available resources that exist in the U.S. In other words, I can go, at the time, I could go to the FAA and get weather. I could file flight plans. I could be followed on a flight plan.
Right.
All those things. And so then you get into Africa and you realize, or into Brazil, you realize that none of those things are available. So I wasn't equipped to fly with none of those things available. I survived that first term, but then when I got to JAARS and realized that there are things you can learn about weather cycles, that you can learn about mountain flying, that you can see, you can observe, you can even guess that they're going to happen.
You actually are made aware of what indicators to look at.
Right. In Brazil, you remember that the wind would blow and then some of those big old fingered leaves would flip over and they'd go from green to whitish.
The underside is lighter
yeah.
colored.
And so you'd see that there's a wind blowing, and then you could even sort of tell which direction it was blowing by that, even though you might not have smoke or anything to tell you. And here in the Smoky Mountains, it's the same thing. You can look at the treetops and they'll be shimmering at you, or they'll flip over and they'll turn light, and you'll see that same thing.
And there's actually a certain velocity of wind that will turn a leaf over.
Yeah.
And isn't that cool that there are indicators even in uncharted environments? And so JAARS, I hear you saying that JAARS helps you understand some of those indicators so that even though you're going to a place you haven't been before, there's resources and tools that might not be part of an external structure, but
right. I mean, the other thing too is all of those things that you're talking about, the ways to be able to evaluate, to see, to give you data for your safe flying, are also combined with the fact that JAARS has a standard. We fly to a standard. And if you don't have a standard, what will you say no to?
How far are you from what it said standard?
Correct.
You don't have a baseline.
Nothing. And then it becomes one pilot does one thing, and a better pilot does this, and the real hot dog pilot, he can handle this. But in JAARS, every pilot flies to a set standard, and that is your fence that keeps you safe. And anything outside of it, not allowed. You can be closer to the center and safer if you're feeling tired or if you're not as experienced, but you're inside this safe zone that I can only fly in these conditions with only this much weight, only till, this time of day because of sunset, this many hours a day, with this amount of wind on this runway. Everything's specifically laid out where that just didn't exist.
How are you now able, and what does it look like to pass some of that on to the next generation of aviator who many times doesn't come through the upbringing that you and I had?
Yeah.
And so how is some of that received, and how are you translating your experience into the next generation of aviator?
Well, first, I do tell my stories of all of the bad things I did with the lack of training that I had. So that
you don't sugarcoat it,
right? That lets them know that I should have been dead in certain cases, or that I wasn't sufficient with what I had straight out of a 141 school. But,
and let's be clear, Luterno's an amazing aviation school.
Sure, right. But it's just
preparing aviators for different environments.
Yeah. But the receiving of that kind of input varies, right? So I'll get this generation, you're talking about this generation, or even now, we have people in our current pre-field orientation, the training of guys before they go overseas, who are in their 40s, and we have some who are in their early 20s. And so the reception of input can be, the older guy can sometimes be harder to receive input because he's already set in his ways. Or he could be very wise and go, I need to listen. It just depends on his life experiences and his upbringing. So like even your family upbringing, like I was raised on a farm. I was raised by fairly strict parents who love the Lord, but they are always people that we listen to, always people whose opinion and input we like it, we want it. And then yet now we have another generation who might be coming from another area of the U.S. Where input from older people is not valued. I'm not saying that that's the case, but if you get people from a city or a farm, two very, very different type of people and very different in their reception of input.
And both can be successful in mission aviation because you do look at what we call the KSAs, knowledge, skills, and attributes. So you're looking for specific attributes like teachability and judgment and some of those things.
Right.
So that's very true. And so the attributes part, the knowledge and the skills, you and I can learn. You can learn to fly a helicopter. And it's a given.
Let's
you can
do
do
that.
it. Yeah, let's do it. Start next week. And so I can teach you the skills. You can read and learn the knowledge. You can even get it from somebody else. But the attributes are an area that are a little harder for me to actually affect. It's easier for me to affect those in young people because they're still being formed. In older people, they're pretty much set.
You gave us a lot to think about, Mike. I guess in closing, what is one life lesson? What's something you learned that you would have liked to tell your 20-something-year-old self?
I think it ties into even the 7-year pause waiting for that airplane to come, but God's timing, God's provision. So I was Jody and I were really young, raising our money to go to Africa. And after a church service in a big church and a very poor response, I was yelling at God audibly in the bedroom of the pastor's house that we were staying with. And Jody was like looking at me like lightning was going to strike me or something. And she goes, "What are you doing, Mike?" And I was just, "God, why aren't you, providing for us, supplying our needs?" And later that night, we went to an inner city church of about maybe 15 people, street people and everything. And they took up just this very generous offering compared to the people. You know what I mean? I remember the one was $121 and like 50 something cents. And the other one was $400 and something. And money doesn't matter, right? But as
the widow's mite.
Yeah, as a new person, new missionary, I was really learning, and I had not learned this lesson. But those two things happened. That church service, me yelling at God because the church wasn't providing, and then God's provision through an unlikely place. And we went out to dinner that night, that very same night, with an old missionary couple. He didn't hear my story. He didn't know my story. He didn't know what had happened that day. And he said, "Mike and Jody, the one thing you need to learn to remember is that God is your provider and man is not, and the church is not. And God will make them fail until you look to him for your provision. And if you look to man, God will make them fail until you learn the lesson." And it was just like a wake-up call, slap in the face at the same time. But that same thing, that as I was waiting 7 years, sometimes grumbling at God, I still would always go back to realizing you're the provider, your timing, your program, and look to God. Look to God. Yeah. Don't look to man. So, big deal.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Mike, I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Uncharted podcast. Please be sure to subscribe, review, and share. Check back soon for more episodes.